Welcome to our conference today, Ending Wars Well, Just War Theory and Conflicts End. My name is Eric Patterson. I'm an assistant director at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown University, and I teach in the Department of Government. And on behalf of the Berkley Center and our director, Tom Banchoff, who's with us this morning, I welcome you to today's proceedings. The Berkley Center was created in the office of Georgetown's president in March of 2006. And the center is dedicated to the interdisciplinary study of religion and the promotion of interreligious understanding. So today's conversations about security, about ethics, and about peace and justice, both in war and particularly after conflict, are particularly appropriate to our mission. Today's events will culminate with a keynote address at 7 o'clock by Michael Walzer, best known for his book, Just and Unjust Wars. Now, this conference is rooted in part in the just war tradition, just war theory, an approach to thinking about the ethical issues involved in real-world conflict that dates back to at least the 4th century AD. President Obama recently emphasized this in his speech accepting the Nobel Prize, in which he said, and I paraphrase, that the concept of just war emerged as codes of law sought to regulate violence within groups, and as philosophers and clerics and statesmen sought to regulate the destructive power of war. Now, until very recently, this tradition focused primarily on two things: the morality of the decision to go to war and the morality of how conflict was fought. What we're talking about today is extending the tradition into a fairly new field of use post bellum, or applying just war to post-conflict. Now, just a caveat, I trust that you won't think that this conversation means that we think that all of the questions about the decision to go to war or how war is fought are done, that we've solved all of those ethical dilemmas. Certainly the issues of the past 10 years, from going to war in Kosovo without UN sanction, through Iraq, contemporary humanitarian interventions and the like, continue to make us think about the decision to go to war and the ethical content about how war is fought. But today's presenters have focused on a number of questions that have to do with specifically the post-conflict or the late conflict scenario. And this was brought home to me in the 2 years I worked for the State Department about how difficult it is to win the peace, how difficult it is to build an enduring peace. I saw people from the UN, from the State Department, from USAID, from our allies like CETA with the Canadians or DFID with the Brits, trying valiantly to do things like bring health and security, to get rid of landmines, to do DDR, which is demobilization, disarmament and reintegration campaigns, to do the kinds of practical political things that would resolve some of the fundamental issues in a conflict and establish an enduring peace. It was very difficult work, as we know. Well, let me simply say that today we brought together some of the best scholars, primarily from North America, to talk about these issues. And here are some of the questions that we prodded them with prior to this conference. Is there a theory or a framework for use post bellum? What ethical considerations should guide war's settlement and its aftermath? How should we deal with issues of order, of justice, of security? Should we add amnesty and forgiveness and reconciliation to this? In cases of protracted conflict, ones that seem to go on interminably over decades, in failing states, in places where there's been genocide or war crimes, is there some sort of framework that we can devise for establishing an enduring settlement that's both pragmatic, in other words, it works, and yet it's sensitive to our moral conscience? And finally, are there obligations of the victor, of the vanquished, of the international community? And finally, is this whole thing a smokescreen? Is it moral idealism that's really naive? Is it a smokescreen for Western imperialism? Or is there rich moral content that should span the globe? And of course, these answers are of particular significance right now, as there are very high expectations for U.S. foreign policy in the era of a new president. Well, at this point, I'd like to turn it to our first panel. That's why you're here, is to hear from them. But let me note that one of our colleagues, Mark Evans from Swansea University in the UK, won't be with us today. His plane is delayed thanks to Iceland's volcano, And one of our excellent grad students, Ilan Cooper, worked with Dr. Evans to shorten the paper, and he'll start by reading that today. At this point, let me turn it over to my colleague, Professor Howard from Georgetown University.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks. Can you hear me? Thanks, everyone, for coming today. Come on in. My name is Lise Howard. I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of Government, and I work on questions of civil wars and especially how they end. So I'm very happy to be a part of this workshop today. Thanks very much to Eric Patterson and to Tom Bamchoff for making this possible. So first up on our panel, I will introduce Ilan Cooper very briefly. He's a leading second-year student in the master's program in conflict resolution, and he is sitting in for Mark Evans, who's a reader in politics at the Center for the Study of Culture and Politics at Swansea University. He's also the director of the Graduate Center of the School of Arts and Humanities. He's the author of numerous articles about use post-bellum. He is the editor of a book called Just War Theory, a Reappraisal, and he's currently working on a book about use post-bellum. And the title of his talk, which Ilan has very graciously agreed to read, is Just Peace, an Elusive Ideal. Thanks, go ahead.
So I'm deeply disappointed not to have been here with you in person today. I was looking forward to it very much. I wish you all a successful conference. I'm also very grateful to Eric Patterson for the invitation to contribute to this event. Let us begin. Absolutely central to the case for a theory of just post-bellum is the ideal of a just peace. This centrality is evident in both types of context in which we may invoke the tenets of such a theory. The first is where just post-bellum is added to the traditional bipartite structure of the just war theory, which holds that the ultimate goal of a just war has to be a just peace. This addition is needed insofar as, A, some sense of what this goal means is needed not only in the original justification of a just war, but also where possible and appropriate to orient its conduct. B, it matters greatly to the achievement of just peace how a just war is ended. C, insofar as a just peace is not secured simply by silencing the guns, the ideal must govern the processes of peace building, especially with respect to specifying the responsibilities as well as the rights of just victors. The second context arises insofar as we wish to talk about what justice permits and demands in the ending and aftermath of a war that had no initial moral sanction, or lost whatever sanction it started with. This is because the immorality of an unjust war does not free its participants from morality's obligations in rectifying the initial wrong, or alleviating the harm and repairing the damage it has caused. A just peace is still desirable, and may still be possible, even after such a war. The ideal should thus, where possible, govern planning and conduct in such circumstances. Thus, it makes sense to talk of just post-bellum for agents other than just victors, and in circumstances other than the ending or aftermath of a just war. One could readily agree with the above observations about its importance, but argue that just peace is an elusive concept, a characteristic which might help to explain the relative lack of attention paid to it. There are two senses in which the claim that it is elusive can be intended. One, as a state of affairs, it is in general unobtainable, and two, as a concept, it eludes clear and coherent exposition. It evades attempts to define it adequately, such that, while we may agree that it is an important ideal, we cannot say much to illuminate what it actually denotes. For this morning, I will focus our attention on the second sense, on just peace and an elusive concept. The elusive nature of just peace can also be rendered in various ways. Not as all of them are compatible with each other, though more than one of them could be invoked in the same argument to explain and justify the elusiveness claim. 5 of them are: 1. What just peace actually means and requires can shift during the course of a war. It is a moving target in analysis, even in a single situation. 2. Justice and peace are essentially contested concepts, varying in meaning and implications across time and space, and can only therefore be understood on a case-by-case basis. 3. Even if we can talk about justice and peace in general universalizable terms, their meaning, and especially their practical implications, can only be understood in context. 4. Insofar as just peace is an objective of ex-competence, there is no definitive way of identifying what should and should not count as constitutive of it, and that we can say its construction has been achieved. 5. Insofar as just peace is a balance of justice and peace, we cannot know that that balance is adequately struck to deliver the ideal, because its two constituents are incommensurate. There is no accepted common standard by which the two can be weighed up and their requirements traded off against each other. Those who are persuaded by this form of the elusive charge against just peace are therefore prone to treat talk of just peace as being little more than a rhetorical slogan. Any attempt to develop it into a concept that could resist the objections would, in these critics' view, be futile. It would be crushed under the weight of impossible expectations and internal contradictions. I shall not pretend to be fully able to satisfy just peace's critics from whatever direction their skepticism is mounted. I will map some sources of elusiveness in this paper, but I want to begin by arguing that all need not be silent in elucidating just peace. The approach I use, which is characteristic of analytic philosophy, wishes to abstract from the complexities of individual concrete situations because they are typically messy, conflicting, and confusing. In the face of this, we wish to seek order and consistency in our moral judgments by employing general points of principle as and when we can, even if only as regulative and hence incomplete ideals. The method of reflective equilibrium, which is frequently employed in the process of abstraction, proceeds from individual judgments about specific situations, proposes the general principles that may be informing them, and then seeks to modify both the individual and judgments and the mooted principles until they are brought into mutually supportive equilibrium with each other. The paper addresses the reservations about this methodology. A common and powerful criticism of certain peace-building projects, where the concept of just peace is clearly at issue, says that their mistakes have arisen from precisely this kind of abstractive methodology on the part of policymakers, stepping back too far from the all-important details of context to attempt the imposition of an abstractly conceived blueprint that, precisely because of its context insensitivity, was doomed to fail. If the defense of just peace as a regulative ideal is to succeed, then it has to show how it can avoid the problem of over-abstraction. A vivid contemporary way of illustrating the challenge is to ask ourselves what would count as a just peace in Iraq and especially Afghanistan. But in my estimation, thinking about these two situations generates powerful intuitions on both sides of the argument. On the one hand, it seems bewilderingly difficult to imagine a possible settlement which could count as sufficiently just. Yet on the other hand, it is not difficult to formulate some clear ideas about what would count as an unjust settlement. Many critics of what has happened in these two states very obviously have found it a straightforward business to do so. By contraposition, then, we can begin to piece together some idea of what justice would require. The rest of this paper is a partial attempt to answer this question. What are the characteristics of a just peace? Now, obviously, because each war is in some sense unique, we must not look for a one-size-fits-all account of to what it is that just peace as an ideal must apply. To illustrate simply, one type of interstate war might be satisfactorily concluded from just peace's perspective simply by restoring the right kind of relationship between the two, without raising any concern with the internal domestic constitution of the states in question. This can be contrasted with a war that is concluded with the occupation of one state by another. Here, just peace is very likely going to have, as at least part of its focus, the internal condition of the occupied state. Civil wars and other wars of not of the state-to-state type will differ again on this score. This brings to the forefront an important dispute in terms of a distinction between what I call restricted conceptions of jus post bellum, so named because they restrict their concerns to the ending and immediate aftermath of war, and extended conceptions, so named because they expand their concerns to broader or deeper issues, and thus in all probability extend the time frame during which jus post bellum's objectives are to be pursued. Brian Oren's model of jus post bellum is representative of the restrictive variant. His model includes the following: considerations of proportionality, discrimination, and publicity, the vindication of basic rights, and considerations of punishment, such as for violations of the War Convention, and compensation, as well as political reconciliation. In some conceivable circumstances, this set could well suffice as a specification of just victors' rights and responsibilities, but there are some respects in other conceivable scenarios in which it might prove to be inadequate. For example, in occupation scenarios, one may wonder whether just occupiers have rather more extensive and hence potentially longer-term responsibilities than is suggested by Oren's rehabilitation category. If we grant that just victors have some responsibilities for peace building, we may identify the following three general areas of potential focus. 1. Reconstruction of the physical infrastructure of the defeated society. 2. Appropriate distribution of material resources, which may go some way beyond reparations. And 3. Appropriate establishment of socio-cultural institutions, practices, and relationships. And if peace building is about more than putting the defeated society back on its feet and in the right kind of relationship with a just victor, if that alone may not be sufficient to establish a stable peace somewhat more widely for the former enemies, then we might add 4. Pursuit of diplomatic initiatives to institutionalize peace more widely. Hence, in my extended alternative to the restricted conception, I offer a more thematic list of concerns, which is designed to provide a covering statement of jus post bellum in general, the full understandings and implications of which have to be worked out on a case-by-case basis. For today, let me suggest 5 concerns for my extended version of jus post bellum. To secure justice in the ending and aftermath of war, one must be prepared to A. Set peace terms which are proportionally determined to make that peace just and stable, as well as to redress the injustice which prompted the conflict. B. Take full responsibility for their fair share of the material burdens of the war's aftermath in constructing a just and stable peace. C. Pursue those national and international political initiatives for war prevention. D. Take a full and proactive part in the ethical and socio-cultural processes of forgiveness and reconciliation that are central to the construction of a just and stable peace. And E. Where just combatants occupy a defeated unjust aggressor and/or are present in another territory in the aftermath of humanitarian intervention, they have a duty to restore sovereignty to territory as soon as is reasonably possible. These broader, more onerous concerns and responsibilities arise insofar as it is the case that justice in the peace sought at war's end may not be achieved simply through punishment and rehabilitation narrowly understood. True, it cannot be the responsibility of just occupiers to restore all the egregious injustices of an occupied society, regardless of that society's contribution to the starting of the conflict. Still less can occupiers have any right, let alone responsibility, to institute anything that does not meet some threshold standard of social justice. Two examples from an occupation scenario, which I shall briefly present, can help to illuminate this claim. First, the socio-economic and political reconstruction in post-war West Germany went well beyond the removal of peace-threatening phenomena and institutions to comprise the standards of minimum justice. Second, the neoliberalization of the post-invasion Iraqi economy as a result of the diktat of Paul Bremer and the Coalition Provisional Authority raises clear and very traditional justice issues about forms of economic organization and distribution of wealth. The general point is that the debate about what counts as a just society in more than mere post-conflict rectifactory terms is impossible to avoid in Iraq. So just peace in general does broach questions which would be asked when we consider the nature of the just society, and there are rival conceptions of social justice which are thus likely to prompt divergent conceptions of just peace. Yet I do want to maintain that most of us can begin this debate with widely shared ideas of what would count as unjust, and political philosophy can help to guide and shape the ensuing discussion towards certain substantive general conclusions, informed with appropriate contextual sensitivity, without pretending that a full-blown universal model of social justice is desirable, or that consensus on key issues will be possible. Two other concepts in particular from my version of extended jus post bellum also seem liable, like justice, to generate rival conceptions. These are forgiveness and reconciliation. I do not think it is too difficult to argue at least a prima facie attractive case for their inclusion in this theory. It does look like a potentially serious deficiency in those accounts of jus post bellum that seem to neglect the obvious and widely acknowledged socio-cultural dimensions of post-conflict reconstruction, as if it was always enough to rebuild a country, punish criminals, and institute the rule of law. But these two concepts are yet more examples of important ideals that nevertheless can mean very different things, and about which a generalized theory may consequently be able to say rather little. Indeed, when we engage with certain specific conceptions of them, we begin to encounter arguments that one or both of them may not be possible or necessary for a just peace. The paper discusses this problem at length, arguing that my version of jus post bellum only insists that forgiveness and reconciliation are necessary in some form for post-conflict justice generally, and it enjoins people to think about their implications for their specific situation. My interim proposal here is that just peace can be characterized in general form using thinly universal concepts and values, which offer initial moral guidance and framing, identifying what needs to be fleshed out more thickly in context, and engaging with the divergences in conception that typically emerges when we try to convert thin into thick concepts. Thus, the ideal need not be elusive even in its general form, and thus need not be so once theorists and practitioners have set out to substantiate it for their own circumstances. In conclusion, I've argued that a just peace may be an elusive concept, but nonetheless a worthy one. It is worthy of being a regulative principle of post-conflict. Moreover, I've begun to make an argument for what I've called elsewhere an extended view of jus post bellum. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ilan. Okay. Ilan has to run off to class. It's interesting. I wonder about the extent to which we'll be talking about forgiveness and reconciliation in our current climate of retributive justice and the rise of the ICC. Well, I'm sure it'll be a theme today. For our second panelist, we have Robert E. Williams, Jr. He's an associate professor of political science at Pepperdine University, and he's the co-author of Seeking Security in an Insecure World. He's also written about arms control and international human rights, and the title of his talk today is A More Perfect Peace, Use Post Bellum and the Ultimate Object of War. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me add my words of thanks to Mark Evans, to the Berkley Center, and to Eric for organizing all of this. It's an honor to be here, and I also want to thank all of you for coming out this morning. Since I have the benefit of being here in person, I'll proceed a little bit differently, maybe not quite so formally, with some comments based on the paper rather than extracts. But let me begin with a monument here in Washington, D.C., near the Ellipse. there is a monument to General William Tecumseh Sherman. His most famous utterance is no doubt the immortal "War is hell" line. But there's a different pronouncement carved on the monument that I want to take as my starting point. Sherman said in 1882, "War's legitimate object is a more perfect peace." Now, there have been others, from Aristotle to St. Augustine to the British military historian and strategist Basil Littlehart, who have said much the same thing. Peace, St. Augustine wrote in The City of God, is the purpose of waging war. What then men want in war is that it should end in peace. This, I think, is an important and somewhat neglected aspect of just war thinking. So my first point is simply this. As the ancients declared, peace is the proper end of war. When we must fight, we should do so fundamentally in order to establish a more perfect peace. Point number two is this. The Wilsonian conception of a war to end all wars is an ambitious but, and here I make a controversial claim perhaps, not altogether utopian extension of the belief that peace is the proper end of war. At a minimum, the object of war ought to be the restoration of peace between the parties to the conflict. The war should end with the elimination of the impediments to future peaceful relations. But it is possible that the aim of a war would be more expansive than this. A state enters war, we hope, out of necessity, perhaps because its survival is at stake. But at some point, if the immediate dangers are fended off, it may be possible to think in terms of other aims. Abraham Lincoln, for example, began the Civil War determined only to save the Union, but he came in time and with different political circumstances to the objective of ending slavery as well. The Allies began World War II, concerned only with their own survival, but they concluded the conflict determined to produce sweeping changes in the structure of the international system. A third point. A war to end all wars is not altogether utopian because there is strong empirical support for the proposition that interstate war is largely a thing of the past. Not only is interstate war on the decline, it is on the decline for reasons we generally understand and can often replicate. There is reason for optimism, perhaps even some satisfaction about our understanding of the correlates of peace. Now, rather than taking the time to try and make the case for the decline of interstate war, let me simply mention a few books that have forcefully argued this point and recommend them to you. We could start with Carl Deutsch, 1957, Political Community in the North Atlantic Area. You could go to John Mueller's Retreat from Doomsday, The Obsolescence of Major War, 1989. A wonderful little book by Dorothy Jones entitled Code of Peace, Ethics and Security in the World of Warlord States. And Michael Mandelbaum's The Ideas That Changed the World, Peace, Democracy, and Free Markets in the 21st Century. And then Charles Kupchan's more recent book, How Enemies Become Friends. Point 4, and maybe it would be good to tell you here that there are only 7, so we're almost done. Change interstate war to intrastate war, and nothing I said in my third point is true. Civil war is not a thing of the past. It is not on the decline. It is not, I would argue, especially well understood, at least not in a way that would make us feel confident about our prospects for ending a lot of them as soon as we muster the will and the resources to do so. My fifth point also relates to civil wars. An especially troublesome aspect of civil wars, aside from the fact that they tend not to be very civil at all, is their tendency to return, sometimes over and over again, after a peace settlement has been reached. A disturbing number of civil wars are manifestations of unfinished business. Paul Collier has pointed out that almost half of all civil wars have erupted following a settlement that supposedly concluded a previous war. Just as much of the world is now enjoying the benefits of what seems like perpetual peace, much of the rest of the world is mired in chronic civil war. Far from a war to end all wars, the typical civil war seems to be a war to ensure more wars. Point number 6. Just war theory does not handle the problems presented by civil war very well. It was developed for, and I think is still generally applied to, interstate wars. This is especially true for the emerging concept of jus post bellum, due, I think, to some of the particular features of civil wars that make peace settlements different than in the case of interstate conflicts. And finally, point 7, this leads me to the belief that we need to rethink jus post bellum with the aim of making it, first, more relevant to the special problems posed by civil wars, and second, with respect to an emphasis on war as a route to peace. That is, we need to think about jus post bellum in light of the idea of war's legitimate object being a more perfect peace. And I will conclude there, and perhaps we can talk further about this later.
Great, thanks very much. I'm pleased to introduce our final speaker on the series, on the panel this morning. George R. Lucas Jr. is professor of philosophy at the U.S. Naval Academy, where he holds the Distinguished Chair in Ethics at the Stockdale Center for Ethics and Leadership. He's also a professor of ethics and public policy at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. And his most recent book is Anthropologists in Arms, The Ethics of Military Anthropology, and that came out in 2009. The title of his talk today is Jus ante and post bellum, Completing the Circle, Breaking the Cycle. Thanks.
Thanks, and good morning, everybody. I noticed that she read my full name so as to correct what probably was otherwise intended as a military deception to draw in more members of the audience this morning by thinking that the real George Lucas was going to come instead of some second-rate journeyman scholar from down the road. I'm getting used to that, so let me share a few thoughts on this additional concept of jus ante bellum. Nature offers two versions of what the noted astronomer Sir Arthur Eddington called the arrow of time, namely physical processes that are either irreversible or reversible. Irreversible processes embody the linear vector that Eddington himself had in mind with this phrase. They are linear in that they have a definite temporal direction, a concrete origin, some defined temporal duration, and a terminus, conclusion, and consequently, as the eminent English-American philosopher A.N. Whitehead put it, a perpetual perishing. Indeed, as Whitehead himself remarked, time itself is a perpetual perishing, a metaphor that seems especially apt for war. Particularly in Whitehead's case, we find the works from which that sort of telling phrase was taken, at least one of them, Principles of Natural Knowledge in 1919, was dedicated to his eldest son, Eric Alfred Whitehead, who was killed with the Royal Flying Corps in the battle, air war, over the English Channel, defending London from German attack on March 13th, 1918. But nature also exhibits other processes that are enduring, repetitive, cyclical, ongoing, and hence reversible. Temporally speaking, as the equally eminent German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel observed regarding their circularity, these processes have no beginning and no end, a metaphor that in darker moments seems equally apt for war. War presents itself as linear, a vector with an origin, a duration, a terminus, and damage done over its temporal duration that often seems irreversible. War's effects cannot be undone, and in that sense they may seem linear, but wars that do not end well threaten to beget new wars that, as the progeny of the old, perpetuate a cycle of violence and destruction that is unending. It is that never-ending cycle of violence that poets and theologians, harking back to antiquity, have lamented. The justification of war follows or seems to follow the logic of linearity and of irreversibility. Historically, that logic pronounces on war's origins and on its finite duration, constraining the permissible actions of its participants. The first set of these concerns is directed primarily toward political leaders and policymakers concerning when, if ever, it would be permissible to resort to war in defense of a nation or, more troublingly, to further its political objectives or resolve its conflicts with adversaries. The second, somewhat less systematic question is addressed primarily to military leaders and military personnel empowered to wield the sword in pursuit of their nation's policies and objectives. It concerns the limitations or constraints on their behavior, particularly the means and manner in which they may or may not be permitted to resort to the use of deadly force during wartime. Precisely because it is composed of specific and contextual advice rather than abstract principle, use in bello has been somewhat haphazardly and unsystematically enshrined in treaties, conventions, and otherwise in the settled customs or traditional practices within the profession of arms. Until recently, however, less explicit attention was paid to war's ending and aftermath, what we're calling today use post-bellum, or apart from those ancient lamentations to its tendency to perpetuate that unending cycle of violence. Only within the past decade, in fact, has a third mode of discussion emerged, grounded in more careful attention to specific details of proposals that were heretofore taken merely as statements in opposition to war, as well as expressions of profound dissatisfaction with just war doctrine itself by the German Enlightened philosopher Immanuel Kant, as, for example, his seventh thesis in the idea for universal history with a cosmopolitan intent, or his speculative beginning of human history at the conclusion, or his rejoinder to Moses Mendelssohn in the famous essay on the old saw, It's True in Theory but Not in Practice, and of course in his extended commentary on Rousseau in Toward Perpetual Peace. Attributed primarily to the careful analysis of Kant's specific pronouncements on war by Canadian scholar, our guest as well at this conference, Brian Oren, what is now widely termed use post-bellum concerns how wars are to be justly concluded, peace made, treaties negotiated, reconciliations effected, responsibility affixed, punishment administered, or amnesty granted, and especially how devastated victims and nations are to be reconstructed and rehabilitated, all in Kant's systematic vision in order to make future wars less likely. The rise of interest in use post-bellum, not surprisingly, is concurrent with the rise of to the primacy of irregular warfare, or what the Department of Defense is increasingly calling hybrid war in this century, a development that further complicates all the traditional foregoing demarcations. The Swiss jurist and political philosopher Emmer Vattel was responsible for this nomenclature, and it was meant to call attention to a departure from the norm of war as addressed in law. Regular war, according to Vattel, consists in armed conflict between the uniformed military representatives of established nations carried out according to natural law or sanctioned custom. It is that which international law, including the law of armed conflict, principally addresses. Irregular war, by contrast, or what in the more recent term of art was awkwardly called mutua, military operations other than war, was thought to consist in the occasional foray of military forces into ancillary and decided secondary activities like peacekeeping, law enforcement, military interventions for humanitarian purposes, including disaster relief, as at present in Haiti, to all of which the conventional law of armed conflict was much less clearly applicable. In this decade in particular, however, the exception has become the rule. Like it or not, and most military personnel like it not at all, irregular war is likely the only sort of war that nations and their militaries will be called upon to fight. And so I tend to agree with Robert that conventional just war theory is up against a challenge. It needs to be carefully rethought. Developing new rules for these new kinds of wars adds a substantial dimension to present understandings of constraints on the use of military force in furtherance of otherwise legitimate political objectives. In regular or conventional war, for example, the custom long enshrined in international law is to demarcate sharply between the two traditional concerns of cause and conduct. Nations and their leaders and statesmen collectively declare war. That decision constitutes no part of the soldier's function or responsibility. The nations and its leaders should be held accountable for their overall declaration and its consequences, while soldiers, regardless of the side on which they fight, are thought in law to be rightly held responsible only for their individual conduct in carrying out those broad orders. This division of moral responsibility is the cornerstone of what our esteemed keynote speaker tonight, Michael Walzer, first described in 1977 as the War Convention. Irregular warfare, by its very nature, undermines that convention. If the boundaries between cause and conduct are clear in conventional warfare, they are inherently less so in irregular conflicts, generating a host of legal and moral anomalies. Critics of America's irregular wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, such as Anthony Cody and Jeff McMahon, for example, have pointed to what they term an asymmetry in use in bello that arises in respect to soldiers and their conduct whenever their leader's cause for war is found to be morally unsustainable. Because the justification for engaging in such hostilities is inherently tenuous and seldom a straightforward case of self-defense or response to aggression, principles like proportionality and double effect, taken in the War Convention to determine culpability or permissibility of tactical actions, must be calculated differently. Combatants representing nations whose cause for irregular war cannot be sustained have, for example, no moral right on these accounts to kill alleged enemy combatants, whether such killing is otherwise found proportional to their military objective or not, and whether it would otherwise be excused traditionally under existing international humanitarian law or by the doctrine of double effect or not. That is, their nations and leaders' moral errors regarding cause taint the soldiers' conduct of those unjust activities as well in this account. This serves to undermine another cornerstone of the War Convention, the so-called moral equality of combatants, something we might want to talk about. This is a much contested issue and a deeply troubling one for reasons I'm happy to share for me personally. In quite a different sense, irregular war oscillates unpredictably between routine combat and security and constabulary operations. When simply engaged in providing security as part of a post-war occupation force, the sort of thing that Michael Evans was trying to talk about in his extended notion of use post bellum. In that situation, soldiers are more constrained in their permissible use of deadly force, and hence inherently more liable to risk of harm themselves than in the former. This perspective and insight is contained in the U.S. Army's recent 2006 edition under the editorship of General David Petraeus of the Counterinsurgency Manual. And it's, again, a very troubling feature and a very problematic one for those who are asked to fight these wars. Failure to recognize and adjust to these changing circumstances, the Counterinsurgency Manual explains, may undermine the justice of the intervening nation's cause through the individual soldiers, the strategic corporal's actions. A situation, as I note in some of my other work, that's all but in the most extreme cases inconceivable under conventional circumstances. Another troubling characteristic of irregular warfare is the tendency of combat operations themselves to shift unpredictably between routine in bello conditions, what we might, and another phase that might plausibly be called ex bello, efforts to extricate the intervening forces from active hostilities, and finally the one we're discussing this morning, post bellum, entailing security operations and provisional reconstruction of the host nation. In hybrid war, of which Afghanistan and the Taliban at present constitute an excellent illustration, a hot conflict between conventional adversaries is often interspersed with what otherwise seems to be a long-standing, going on 9 years in this case, post-war occupation by NATO and coalition troops. Traditional conceptions of military necessity and proportionality that intrude upon the principle of distinction and non-combatant immunity during wartime no longer obtain in the ex bello or post bellum circumstances. That is, they no longer are so, they no longer provide quite as much of an excuse for the damage and the harm that may come to non-combatants as they did during conventional war or the hot conflict. In the context of rebuilding a war-shattered nation and extricating one's own occupation troops from it, more restrictions are placed upon the use of force by occupation forces, and their efforts morph from conventional warfighting to peacekeeping, stability, and the prevention or avoidance of conflict and civilian casualties. While this post-bellum feature of counterinsurgency, humanitarian intervention, and other forms of irregular warfare is now increasingly acknowledged, it's far from well understood. Any attempt to encompass new rules for IW conflicts must surely take account of this recent development in just war theory. And it's valuable to do, as I focus in the paper and most of the remaining part of the paper, on the work of people like Brian Orend and Anthony Cody, the Australian philosopher in particular, concerning how we're to understand that phase. Since so much has been said about the details, and Brian is here, he will talk about his own doctrine, I'll simply summarize that piece and move to the conclusion and say that my own account of this work, trying to get a handle on it, started out to be a commentary on the recent work of Orend and Cody, set against the backdrop of classical perspectives from Michael Walzer, James Turner Johnson, and Jean Bethke Elshtain. And it ended up, in my opinion, being an unwieldy pastiche of other people's good ideas, interesting ideas, and good opinions, with little of my own to add, save that mythopoetic commentary on war and the nature of time at the beginning. The point is, if there's any seriousness to that commentary, it's the observation that there's some kind of preparatory state, as well as postlude, to acts of violent conflict resolution. This idea of an orderly, linear march up to and into war that serves as the underlying conceptual framework of the classical just war doctrine is inaccurate, incomplete. It's not simply that leaders must judge when to wage wars or soldiers how to fight them. It's not even that everyone involved must worry about how to clean up the mess afterwards. One must also ask, and the central question my paper concludes in asking, is how are leaders supposed to be prepared to know how to judge the causes and implications of war? How are soldiers supposed to know how to fight and how to end these hostilities? Does not the aftermath of one war frame the interstices in which lessons are learned, concepts taught, and capacities developed to handle conflict more adequately in the future, and hopefully to avoid it altogether, or minimize its destructive impact when it cannot be avoided? How is all that education to occur? That is a topic, I think, that is of great concern, but it hasn't really received explicit attention, and I think it deserves attention in the context of use post-bellum. You could call it, as a colleague does, just military preparedness. How does a nation and its people and its armies and warriors train themselves to be able to carry out all of these and live within all the restrictions that I just described? Recognize all the legitimate versus illegitimate causes of war? How do you develop a leadership with the capacity to set the example for the troops that are led, both to resist unjust orders, for example, and to provide sound military advice to political leaders contemplating going into war? An issue that if you followed the so-called revolt of the generals in 2006, came to the fore when my colleague Tony Zinni in the Marine Corps, a retired Marine general, and General Paul Eaton, thank you, and several other generals expressed their frustration with the previous administration's policy. All this sort of thing needs to be ongoing, yet how do you sustain that community of discourse? The remainder of my paper talks about that, and in part, I'm biased because that's what I do for a living. Those are the people with whom I work, but I think it's terribly important to reflect on what it is we want them to study, how it is we want them to think about these questions, and whether it's fair to ask them to bear the kinds of responsibilities that people like Cody and Jeff McMahon are now prepared to offload upon them, of being unjust combatants in an unjust war, for example, and no longer subject to the protections of the war convention, such as the moral equality of soldiers. How's that all going to work? What kind of sense does that make? That's something that a colleague of mine in a recent book that I have up here in front of me, Professor Roger Wertheimer, who previously held the chair that I now have, calls use ante bellum. That is the just preparedness of military to conduct conflicts on our behalf. A number of people who've talked about this, and with this I'll stop and let us engage in some conversation about these ideas. A number of people who've talked about use post bellum and also educating the military, just military preparedness, and the nation's policy and so forth, have been very critical of America in this regard, both the policies that it enacts and also the training that it provides its warriors, thinking it's insufficient. Although Roger, in his recent essays on use ante bellum, thinks that there has been what he calls a great awakening in this regard in the century in the aftermath of these two wars, and that we're beginning to do a much better job of recognizing our responsibility to educate both the warriors and the general public, the civic discourse, about how to prepare for war, respond to conflict, and send our troops into battle. A very interesting development that I think will tie in with some of our other guests today is a group that's headquartered in the UK and really involves NATO nations, all involved in reflecting together on thinking about this kind of ethical preparation and leadership preparation, particularly of warriors. They talk in their work, the Military Ethics Education Network, of ethical interoperability that we need among coalition forces, the US, the UK, our Australian colleagues, the Dutch, the Germans. We need to share notions of just conduct in war, of the code of the warrior, of the goals that irregular warfare and challenges that it presents to us, how to conduct it properly. And they've done a terrific job with the help of people like Al Pierce, who's here today, and advised them on these issues and joins in their conversation in talking about how ethics education in the military is conducted. I have a volume that they put out, Ethics Education in the Military, and even more timely, a volume that I don't have that you're welcome to examine, to which I wrote a very appreciative foreword, Ethics Education for Irregular Warfare. All of this, I simply submit in conclusion, is a dimension of this use post bellum that it is, if you want occupation troops to know how to behave, to conduct themselves justly, to provide protection to civilians, to know what constitutes judicious use of force in these unconventional situations, one has to invest a great deal in their education and in their becoming familiar with the works of many of the people who are here and discussing the issues that we're here to discuss this afternoon. And that, or this morning, let me conclude.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Professors Williams and Lucas. Well, I have some questions, so I'll start with questions. I don't see any hands yet, and then maybe, great. I have 1 point and 2 questions, and I'll take the prerogative chair and then move on to some others. Just one minor point, which is that Paul Collier actually refuted that finding that 50% of civil wars resume. It was a big splashy finding that Kofi Annan and many others have cited a lot since he found it, but in his later work he actually found that the return rate is not nearly 50%, and Astri Surki has an elaborate refutation of that finding in International Peacekeeping that came out a couple of years ago. But anyway, so the return to war is not as common as we might think it is after peace deals. I'm wondering about how our discussion today links up with the recent work about the microfoundations of war, and especially the microfoundations of violence. We have a lot of new literature these days that separates the origins of violence from the origins of civil wars. And one of the main findings is that the use of violence in civil wars is often not instrumental or logical. That the occurrence of violence needs to be separated from the concept of the occurrence of war. That the reasons for war are not always the same as the reasons for violence, and how we incorporate that into our thinkings about what just war is. So that's just a question, but my final question really relates more to the presentation we just had. How do we conclude a war justly if the origins of the war are not just? If the origins of the civil war, I'm thinking of civil wars and any number of civil wars that we have going on that are winding down now in the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Sudan or Somalia. If the origins of the war don't, we don't have just cause, we don't have proportionality, we don't have protections of civilians, we have a lot of war crimes. When you have an unjust war, whose responsibility is it to conclude it justly, and how do we conclude it justly?
That's a great question, and certainly one that weighs on my mind and my colleagues' mind quite heavily, I must say. And I think, to be fair, one would have to say, under contested circumstances where the justice of one's cause is, to put it mildly or politely, a matter of dispute. Is it possible, notwithstanding, when engaged in a war that is a matter of controversy, to bring the hostilities to a just conclusion? Actually, it is really a shame that Mark Evans is not here, because his paper really addresses that question in great detail. And I think he has, well, it's a very complicated matter. His notion of extended use post bellum tries to take that into account, far more than the simple phrase that we heard bandied about a few years ago, the pottery barn concept, you broke it, you buy it. It is something like that, but something very profound about a society that you may have mistakenly or inadvertently broken or made worse than it was, or perhaps not had the reasons to intervene in that you thought you did. Nonetheless, you have an obligation to make reparations for your damage, to repair the damage done, to restore some measure of normalcy and peace, elusive though that may be. And again, in Mark's account of it, that obligation falls upon us. And I think, in reality, that this is one you see NATO coalition forces in Afghanistan, and certainly America and its coalition partners in Iraq shouldering, to a greater or lesser extent of success, but certainly with a deliberation that this must be done. You can't just say, oops, and go home. Gosh, I'm sorry we made a mistake, if indeed a mistake was made. I mean, this is still an arguable case. So it's an important question. Is it still possible to salvage justice from conflict or uncertainty or just a downright error in judgment? And Evans suggests, I think, that it is. And indeed, not only is it, it's incumbent upon us. In that wars causes, as Professor Walser put in an essay of his some years ago, that's in this volume, in fact, there's always going to be a matter of dispute. Reasonable people can reasonably disagree about this, but what you can't disagree about is how you wind it up, and whether or not, all things considered, the people in the zone of conflict are living a better or worse life. So Tony Cody, in his work on use post bellum, also discusses this at some length, and the prospects are there, but they're certainly difficult.
Great, thanks.
I guess I would also say that in our normal discourse, we have a notion of exacerbating factors. We can understand that when, say, a crime has been committed, there are some things that make it worse, and some things that make the culpability for the crime more serious. And I think if we say that an unjust war has no further moral dimension, we're sort of denying the possibility that you can in fact make a bad situation worse with an unjust peace. So.
Okay, wow. I think we'll have to group questions. I saw Father Langham in the back, and then right here. Let's go three here. Thanks.
I think I can be very brief. It seems to me that...
Oh,
For the
yeah,
mic.
sorry, here comes the microphone.
It seems to me that precisely when you have an unjust war on your hands, that makes ending it well even more imperative. I think one of the big problems is that the very language of just war seems to imply that there is, in effect, one moral reality. And if you can't get that moral reality right from the beginning, then you're kind of in a moral failure zone, and differences there don't matter very much. And I think that involves a perfectionist and an approach to morality which is both overly demanding and overly optimistic.
Thanks. Let's take two more and then we'll move on to, great. Yeah.
This is for Professor Lucas. Sir, thank you for your talk on the issue of just military preparedness. Returning to your commentary on FM 324, the counterinsurgency manual, one of the principles of the counterinsurgency manual is that within irregular warfare, I guess the center of gravity or the final victory is probably going to be done in a way that is non-military. So the question then, sir, is sort of how do we do just preparedness or just education for members both of the military and the non-military, and how do we do integration, and is there anyone working on that question?
I think the answer is yes. There are certainly people. I'm sorry.
If you don't mind holding on
Oh,
just
okay.
for one, we'll take three. I don't think we'll be
excuse me.
able to get
Okay.
through now if we, there we go.
General Sherman was mentioned. I think it was General MacArthur who said there's no substitute for victory. And this raises the concept of victor's justice. One word was not mentioned during the discussion. That word is Vietnam. Okay? 1975, Vietnam sent practically its entire army south, conquered South Vietnam. Was that just? It was definitive. Or was it just? The people of South Vietnam fled. We saw the pictures, trying to flee. Thousands of people in leaky boats. Even in Nazi-occupied France, you didn't see this. So my question to you, was this a just peace? It was a final peace. If yes, why was it just? If no, then why does it matter? Because it was definitive and accepted internationally.
Okay. Pleasure's all yours. So if you want to answer any of the three, and then we can move on to another three.
I think the first one was yours.
I think it was. Let me just try briefly to answer that first one. And I'm still thinking about Vietnam. I think that's a tough. I think we are all still thinking about Vietnam. In a way, that's a shadow that we can't get out from under, and yet it's a very an odd metaphor, an illuminating one, an illuminating darkness that helps us reflect more seriously and consciously than we did at the time on these issues. Now, what the answer is, whether that was a just peace, not so for the boat people, certainly, and yet was the necessity of their fleeing as grave as they took it to be at the time? I often think, it was the right idea, wrong place. It was next door in Cambodia that we needed to fear what was about to transpire, although some think the just or unjust peace in Vietnam brought about the Cambodia. Anyway, as to what people are doing to, particularly with military, to help them think about the fact that in the end it's not going to be their work as military, as combatants that will bring a war to a conclusion, that the center of gravity is political, not military. That's absolutely right. It's a central doctrine in the counterinsurgency manual, and again, deeply frustrating and troubling to people who know how to, as they put it, in this kind of rough and ready way, we know how to kill people and break things until you tell us to stop. And now we have to tell them things like, well, that's not the mission anymore. The mission is there are other people who are killing people and breaking things, and we need you to go in there and tell them to stop. In a sense, there's even more risk to you in doing that than there was to doing what you used to do. So that's your piece of this. And then how, on the other side, when Professor Elstein very graciously and firmly in 2003 refused to sign a statement of her fellow theologians, 100 or so of them, concerning the injustice of the war in Iraq, I think she did so. I don't want to put words in her mouth. She's here. She can speak for herself. But I think she did that and did that rightly because she recognized that that document was not rightly put. It wasn't carefully thought out. It was inaccurate. It probably didn't take account of the complexities of the situation at the time or since. But more than that, I think it reflected a woeful ignorance on the part of the American public generally about the issues we're discussing here, not just use post-bellum, but the whole just war tradition, because again, in the aftermath of Vietnam, we just let that go. People weren't talking about it, despite all the wonderful work we had. Michael Walzer and others, that groups read this, but by and large in colleges and universities and public discourse, that had all just gone away. It was forgetfulness, again, another interesting phrase of Hegel's, forgetfulness. And it served us poorly when the time came for good, intelligent, critical, complex public discourse on the matter. So, you don't just need to educate the soldiers to know how to deal with political realities that are more political than military. We need a public that was far more prepared than ours was at the time to engage in a critical debate on just war.
Let me add about Vietnam, and it's a very difficult question, obviously, but much of the answer to that question will hinge on whether you see the Vietnam War as a war of the aggression of North Vietnam against a separate sovereign state in the South, or whether you perceive that to have been a war of unification for the Vietnamese people. Now, as for atrocities at the end of the war and after the war, this complicates the matter. It makes it a more vexing problem. But I would argue that there are many, many instances in history in which even good wars, and not judging the question of the North Vietnamese victory in Vietnam, but many instances in which even good wars have had some very, very negative consequences. There's a book, and I apologize for not being able to remember the author's name, but a fairly recent book on the end of World War II entitled The Bitter Road to Freedom, which catalogs in fairly massive detail some of the terrible sufferings of liberated peoples at the end of World War II. Sometimes those sufferings, in fact, were at the hands of their liberators. And we know, for example, of what happened for people in Eastern Europe. That perhaps was not liberation, but nonetheless, sometimes wars, even good wars, end with very, very bad things. And this is partly, of course, why we're trying to talk about and think seriously about justice after war. But the question on Vietnam, it does seem to me, hinges very much on how you frame what was going on in the first place.
Thanks. All right, I saw lots of hands, and we have 7 minutes left. So I want to start with Reverend Dr. Liz Carmichael because she's here because of the volcanic ash in the sky. She's not able to go home to Oxford. And let's move, I think I saw 4 hands here, and then if we don't have time to answer them all, at least we'll hear the questions. Does that sound good?
Thank you very much, Lisa. I'd like to raise a fundamental question. Augustine wisely said, people who go to war say that they do so in order to establish peace. The problem is, he went on to say, different people have different ideas of what peace is. And I'd just like to raise the question, who decides what kind of peace, and how context-specific can a Western democracy allow a peace to be? For example, in Afghanistan, do we impose women's education, or do we try to impose inclusive government and then leave it to people to decide whether women are educated or not, and so on? It's the broad question I'd like to ask. How context-specific, and who decides?
I'm Enver Masood with the Wisdom Fund. My question relates to the comment made over there. Can you ever have a just peace if the most powerful party to the conflict is overwhelmingly guilty? For example, if their leaders are guilty of war crimes, they owe massive reparations, and they lied about the initial reasons for the war. Very specifically, in the case of Afghanistan, there's now overwhelming evidence that the official account of 9/11 is a lie. The evidence promised by Colin Powell at the Security Council against bin Laden was never provided. Our own FBI to this very day says they have no hard evidence against bin Laden.
Hi, I'm Dr. Marianne Love from Catholic University. On this question of morality of war after unjust war, and this question of what kind of peace that we seek, just want to draw your attention. There's a volume coming out this fall on the ethics and theology of Catholic peace building with Scott Appleby as the editor. I've got a chapter in it called What Kind of Peace Do We Seek?, which addresses this question because I'm concerned about the linearity versus the cyclical nature of conflict, and concerned about just this very question when most wars in the world are unjust, most wars in the world are civil conflicts, yet we still have moral obligations on those most unjust circumstances. So one way to go is to look to philosophers and theologians to say, what would you advise? Another slightly different path would be to look at practitioners who are out there building peace and say, what are they doing in places like DRC, Rwanda, where there's absolutely no justice in the conflict, but you still have the task of rebuilding afterwards. So I'd love to get your comments on this work that's coming out this fall, but also to ask how, I think you can't, the question that you raise about conflict versus violence, war versus violence. If our cutoff for war is 1,000 dead in a campaign in a year, but the conflict may go on over 20 years, in which case you may surpass that at the end, but not in any particular one. This distinction we often make between war and ongoing violence becomes quite meaningless to the people on the ground. And I think it's another thing we have to think about as we look at these issues of irregular warfare that's quite vexing.
Thank you very much. May I make an observation and question? The three panelists have provided some very rich, deep, and provocative ideas, and I congratulate you for that. I wish to pick up on Professor Lucas and Father Langren's idea about, you alluded to the principle of double effect as a factor that may be morphed into something that would be useful ethically for irregular wars. You also have perhaps needed to go a little bit further in the whole issue of probabilityism and what is the ethical dimensions of an item or a concept that is more probably good than the other. And that's it, those two observations. Your comments on the principle of double effect and probabilityism.
Thanks very much. So we have 3 minutes to answer, if we keep to our time. Okay. Oh, we actually have 8 minutes.
Oh.
Thanks. Okay.
Wow. And that's more than enough to take care of all this.
Okay.
Do you want to start on the last question, or shall I?
Let me see. I keep saying I'll be briefer than I fail to do so, but how can there be a just peace when there's overwhelming guilt? Who decides what kind of peace? Those kinds of questions, again, I'm sorry that the geological tragedy that gave us the pleasure of your company, Reverend, has kept our colleague Mark Evans from being here, because again, both issues that are deeply troubling and complicated are the subject of his paper. And I don't want to speak in his behalf, save to say that he argues that it is possible that one can work your way through. They're deeply context dependent. And one of the frustrations of the so-called JP, just peace concept, is that, and why he calls it in his paper elusive, is that if you start screwing down the nuts and bolts to get it clear, it becomes either unreachable or unsatisfactory. If you back off too much, it becomes so vague as to not even function well as a regulative ideal, let alone as a guide to practical behavior. And yet, he does some very interesting work to see that it's not impossible to imagine what a peace would look like from the perspective, say, of Afghanistan and its current Western occupying forces. Marianne Love's comment on the work on just this topic, I think I would like to look at that book in your chapter. I'm always informed by what you do, bless your heart. Great scholar and colleague. It puts me in mind, however, of one of the discussions we had of the practitioners coming back. We have them all the time coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, talking about what they do and the challenges and the frustrations with this. Recently, we had a very articulate submarine captain in the Navy. His last name was Coolidge, like President Coolidge. He described how he had been IA'd. For those of you who don't know military jargon, that's individually augmented. That means, congratulations, you've drawn a number, you're going to Afghanistan. And of course, that happens to a lot of people, but the individual augmentation refers to people like submarine captains and supply officers and so forth who might have no particular role in that war, but end up, we need people, we need bodies, we need help. And to try and distribute what has largely been a Marine Corps Army fought war fairly into the other areas in the Air Force and the Navy, you have this roulette drawing going on. He had been then sent to head up a provisional reconstruction team in southern Afghanistan, and from time to time was asked to have video conferences with President Karzai and the leadership in Kabul about how things were going down there. And he was describing these, and he got another call, you're going to have a VTC with the president. And he said, oh, I've already talked to Karzai. Oh, no, this is the president wants to talk to you. So he puts on his white uniform and shows up at the facility to describe the day-to-day operations to President Bush, Secretary Rice, and Secretary Gates. And he talked about how he worked his way through this and how poorly prepared he had been. I'm a submarine officer. I don't know anything about building schools and hospitals, but this is what we're doing, and here's how it's going. And don't worry, last night I stayed in a Holiday Inn Express. And he said, when I did this, I was hoping somebody on the other end had seen those commercials. And he said he saw the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense looking at each other straight. I didn't know we had a Holiday Inn in Afghanistan. And President Bush was rolling on the floor in laughter. But he said that in part to, because that's the frustration. We're not prepared. All those commercials are about people doing things for which they have absolutely no background or ability, and yet you find them doing them. That's been the sort of dilemma of the practitioner, and I'm sure Marianne, writing about it, has got some useful insights on the sense in which we are able to take people who are prepared to do 2 or 3 kinds of things over here and put them to work on the kinds of problems that an irregular war like Afghanistan requires and have them rise to the challenge.
Let me suggest something quickly that I hope will maybe touch on several of the questions, and it will not be a complete response to any of them, I'm sure, but with the issues we have concerning the difference between endemic violence and war, where the boundaries are very, very difficult to ascertain, that concern, the concern we have about irregular war and all the excellent comments that Professor Lucas made about the fuzziness, the ambiguities of irregular warfare. I think some of the international lawyers may have hit on something, at least I think they're kind of ahead of us on this, ahead of the ethicists on this. And those who've looked at the question of revising the law of occupation, of occupation after warfare, have in several notable cases suggested that what needs to happen is a merging, a combining of this traditional law of occupation with human rights law, and that we may in fact find some of our answers to some of these questions in international human rights law. I don't quite know exactly where that comes out, but it seems promising to me actually to say that there are some of these situations where we don't know if it's war or if it is some kind of lower level sub-state violence, where if the rules of war, if just war theory doesn't provide the answers, it may well simply be that human rights law does. And that, I think, may apply to a number of these situations. It may also help us with the question of justice after war in the case of an unjust war. Maybe we can't sort out all of the ethical issues, but maybe we can say, here is a point at which we say simply, human rights law applies. And that seems to me to be a reasonably good way to do it.
Great. Well, on that very helpful note, let's conclude our panel for the morning. Thanks very much.
Great.